Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us.
Glad to be here.
Today we're going beyond Shakespeare
Ooh,
and taking a look at the life of King Richard II.
yeah.
Now you might
A
think
figure shrouded in mystery.
you know him
Indeed.
from the play,
Yes.
but there's so much more to his story
Oh, much more indeed.
than we get in Shakespeare.
Absolutely.
So to set the stage,
Right.
Richard II comes to the throne in 1377
Okay.
at just 10 years old.
10 years old. Wow.
His grandfather, Edward III,
Right.
and his father
The Black Prince.
are both dead.
Of course, yes.
England is in the thick of the 100 Years' War
A very turbulent time.
with France.
Yeah.
And this young boy
This young boy.
is suddenly king.
Oh, could you imagine?
Talk about
The
pressure.
weight of the crown.
Oh, yeah.
The expectations.
So the rust upon him.
Lack of a strong role model. I mean,
Yeah.
talk about a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and it doesn't help that Richard is surrounded by ambitious and often scheming relatives.
Oh, always scheming relatives.
So what role did his uncles play in all of this?
Well, you've got John of Gaunt,
Okay.
a powerful and influential figure
Yeah.
who tries to, maintain stability amidst the chaos.
Mm.
He was actually the one who largely governed England during Richard's early years.
Wow. So really kind of like the power behind the throne.
Yeah, you could say that.
But his loyalty was constantly questioned.
Always under suspicion.
So even the loyal ones weren't safe.
No one was safe.
What about his other uncles?
Well, then there's Edmund of Langley,
Okay.
who wasn't quite cut out for,
Yeah.
all the political maneuvering.
Right.
And then you have Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester.
Okay.
Now, he was ambitious
Mm.
and deeply resentful of Richard's authority.
Okay.
This simmering resentment eventually boiled over.
I was going to say, this sounds like a powder keg ready to explode.
It was.
And things didn't end well for Thomas of Woodstock.
They did not.
What happened?
So the power struggle between Richard and Thomas came to a head. And in 1397,
Okay.
Richard had Thomas arrested
Arrested.
in the dead of night.
Oh, wow.
He was secretly transported to Calais and imprisoned.
Secretly.
And, well, let's just say he died under mysterious circumstances while in custody.
Mysterious circumstances, you mean?
The old foul play.
It wasn't until 2 years later,
Okay.
after Richard himself was deposed, that the truth came out.
The truth came out.
During a parliamentary proceeding,
Okay.
a witness named William Bagot
All right.
testified that Richard had ordered Thomas's murder.
Oh, wow.
And to corroborate that, another witness,
Okay.
John Hall,
John.
gave a chilling account
Okay.
of Thomas being suffocated to death.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
So Richard wasn't just, a young king trying to find his way.
Right.
He was willing to eliminate anyone he saw as a threat,
And
even his own family.
even family.
That's cold blood. It really sent shockwaves through the nobility
Yeah, I bet.
because it demonstrated that no one was safe
Right.
from Richard's paranoia and his desire for absolute control.
Really makes you question if Richard was truly fit to rule.
Well, that's a question historians continue to debate.
I bet they do.
On the one hand, he was thrust into an incredibly difficult situation at a very young age.
At 10 years old.
But on the other hand, his actions certainly eroded trust and sowed the seeds of his own downfall.
And speaking of actions that eroded trust,
Mm.
let's talk about Richard's marriages.
Good.
He married twice.
All right.
First to Anna Bohemia,
Yes.
and then, and this is where it gets interesting,
Oh, here we go.
to the 6-year-old
Yes.
daughter of the King of France.
It's a bit of a shocker, isn't it?
What were they thinking?
Now, before we jump to conclusions,
Okay.
it's important to remember that, royal marriages back then,
Right.
they were often strategic alliances,
Right.
not love matches.
Yeah, it was all about politics.
Right.
And Richard, always obsessed with his own power and image,
Okay.
saw this marriage to Isabella of France as a way to secure peace.
Okay, I get the political angle,
Yes.
but a 6-year-old,
I know it seems extreme.
even for those times, it
Mm.
seems extreme.
It does.
But remember, Richard was deeply insecure about his power.
He was very insecure.
Okay.
He saw any potential heir,
Mm-hmm.
especially one that he didn't control,
Right.
as a threat.
So he's thinking way ahead here.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
So marrying a young girl meant he could postpone the question of succession and maintain his grip on the throne?
That's very calculated,
Oh, absolutely.
but also controversial.
Oh, extremely controversial.
Yeah,
I'm
and it
th-
speaks volumes about his
I
priorities,
think he really does.
doesn't it? I mean, he was so fixated on maintaining power
Yes.
that he was willing to enter into this marriage that
Yeah.
most people would consider,
Let's just say unconventional,
to say the least,
to say the very least.
unconventional.
And it gets even more fascinating when you consider that Richard actually rejected
Oh, yeah.
a marriage proposal from his 12-year-old cousin
He did.
because it wouldn't have afforded him the same
The same level of
spectacle
Right.
and political grandstanding.
He wanted that big show.
He wanted the pomp and circumstance.
Exactly.
So tell us about this grand summit.
Okay, so
Paint us a picture.
imagine this lavish tents
Okay.
adorned with cloth of gold,
Wow.
intricate protocols, a dazzling display of wealth and status.
Okay.
It was a medieval version of a red carpet event.
Really?
Yeah, and at the center of it all
Okay.
was Richard,
All right.
flamboyant and power-hungry,
Yeah.
meeting his new father-in-law, Charles VI of France.
Now, wasn't Charles VI known to have some
Yes, he was.
difficulties?
Yes, Charles VI was struggling with bouts of what we would now call mental illness.
Okay. So there's
This fascinating dynamic
Yeah.
between these two kings.
Right.
You have the young, vibrant, but increasingly erratic Richard,
Right.
and then you have the older, ailing, and mentally fragile Charles VI.
Wow. It's almost
Shakespearean.
Yeah.
This clash of personalities on such a grand stage.
And what about young Isabella?
Oh.
Can you imagine being a 6-year-old girl
Taken from your family.
taken from your family
Brought to a foreign country.
to marry a man 3 times your age?
It's a heartbreaking story, really.
Yeah, I bet.
Chronicles of the time tell us that she clung to her dolls as she was handed over to her new life in England.
Oh.
It's a poignant reminder of the human cost of these political games.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine the fear and confusion
Absolutely.
that she must have felt.
Yeah.
And this marriage, a supposed symbol of peace,
Yeah,
ultimately did little to quell the tensions between England and France.
it did not.
So speaking of tensions,
Yeah.
how did Richard eventually lose his grip on power?
Wow.
How did his cousin Henry of Bolingbroke manage to overthrow him?
It was a dramatic turn of events, for sure.
Yeah, it seemed like such a sudden shift.
It was a long time coming.
Really?
Richard's actions had alienated many of his most powerful subjects.
Okay.
His exile of Henry
Okay.
and his broken promise regarding Henry's inheritance were the final straws.
So Henry had a lot of support then
He did.
when he decided to rebel.
Yes, he saw his chance.
Yeah.
He saw his chance.
Okay.
And by the time Henry landed in England,
Okay.
Richard had lost the support of his people.
So the takeover was almost effortless?
It really was.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it seems like Richard's own actions
Yeah.
paved the way for his downfall.
His belief in his divine right to rule,
Right.
his paranoia,
Yeah.
his ruthlessness, his obsession with image over substance.
Right.
These all contributed to his ultimate demise.
Yeah.
But there's also another layer to this story.
Okay.
Even though Henry was successful in deposing Richard,
Right.
he wasn't actually the rightful heir,
Oh.
according to the laws of succession.
So that creates a whole other can of worms.
A whole new set of challenges,
Yeah.
uncertainties for the newly crowned Henry V.
Right.
Yeah.
So the drama doesn't end with Richard's deposition.
No, it doesn't.
What happened to him
Well,
after he was removed from power?
that's where the story gets even more mysterious.
Oh.
Richard was imprisoned at Pontefract Castle.
Pontefract.
Yes. And he died there under circumstances that have been debated by historians for centuries.
Wait, so we don't actually know how he died?
There are many theories,
Really?
but no definitive answers.
Okay.
Some believe he was murdered.
Oh, wow.
On Henry's orders, perhaps starved to death.
Hmm.
Others believe he may have died from grief or illness.
Wow.
What we do know is that his body,
Got
bearing no obvious marks of violence,
Okay.
was put on public display in London.
Why would Henry do that?
It was a calculated move
Okay.
to quell any lingering doubts about Richard's death and to secure Henry's own position as king.
So even in death, Richard was used as a pawn.
That's the tragic reality of Richard II's story.
That is tragic.
Yeah, a
Yeah.
captivating story for sure. And, it's remarkable how much of what we know about Richard II comes from sources written after his death.
Oh, really?
Many of them shaped by the political agendas of, those in power.
That's a good point. I mean, we have to be careful about taking historical accounts at face value,
Oh, absolutely.
especially when it comes to a figure
Yeah.
as controversial as Richard II.
Absolutely. It's
Mhm.
like trying to piece together a puzzle where some of the pieces are missing
Right.
and others have been deliberately altered.
Yeah.
But that's what makes the study of history so fascinating.
Right.
It's a constant process of interpretation and reevaluation.
So let's go back to this idea of Richard's belief in his divine right to rule.
Okay.
How did that shape his actions and ultimately contribute to his downfall?
Well, for Richard, being king wasn't simply about inheriting a title.
Hmm.
He truly believed that his authority came directly from God, making him answerable only to God.
So basically, he thought he was above the law.
In a sense, yes, he saw any challenge to his authority as a sacrilege,
Okay.
a rebellion against God's will.
Wow.
This made him incredibly resistant to compromise and prone to rash decisions.
And we see this play out in his handling of Thomas Woodstock,
Yes.
right? Instead of seeking a political solution
Mm-hmm.
or working within the existing legal framework, he resorts to violence and secrecy.
Precisely. And that decision had far-reaching consequences.
Yeah.
It not only alienated many of his nobles,
Right.
but also created a climate of fear and suspicion
Mm.
in the royal court.
It's almost like he created a self-fulfilling prophecy by acting as if everyone was plotting against him.
That's a very insightful observation.
Thanks.
Richard's paranoia and his belief in his own infallibility blinded him to the very real threat he was creating.
Yeah.
He failed to see that true power comes not just from authority, but also from the trust and loyalty of those you govern.
And that lack of trust was only compounded by his erratic behavior
Yeah.
and questionable decisions.
Right.
Like that time, he appealed to the King of France for help
Oh, yes.
against his own subjects.
That was a major turning point in Richard's reign.
Really?
Remember, England and France were in the midst of the 100 Years' War.
Right.
Richard's decision to seek assistance from the enemy.
I can only imagine how that went over.
It was seen as a betrayal by many of his own people.
Right. Makes you wonder what was going through his mind.
It's difficult to know for sure.
Yeah.
But it seems that Richard's view of kingship had become so distorted that he genuinely believed he was acting in the best interests of England,
Okay.
even if his actions appeared to contradict that.
Wow. So he was really in his own little world.
He was trapped in his own echo chamber,
Yeah.
surrounded by sycophants who reinforced his delusions.
And that brings us back to his marriages,
Hmm.
which seem to have been driven more by a desire to maintain power
Yes.
than by any genuine affection.
His marriages were strategic moves, designed to strengthen his position and enhance his image.
Okay.
His first marriage to Anne of Bohemia was a relatively successful political alliance. But Anne's death in 1394 left Richard without an heir.
And that's when he makes the surprising decision to marry Isabella of France, a
Exactly.
girl barely old enough to attend primary schools in modern times.
Right, and this marriage, while securing a temporary truce with France, ultimately did little to benefit either Richard or Isabella.
Right.
Richard treated Isabella more like a valuable possession than a wife.
Mm-hmm.
And Isabella, a child thrust into a world of courtly intrigue,
Yeah.
found herself isolated and lonely
Oh, that's sad.
in a foreign land.
Two lives caught in the machinations of power.
It is, and it's important to remember that behind the grand historical narratives, there are always human stories.
It's very true.
Lives shaped by forces often beyond their control.
It's easy to forget that
Absolutely.
when you're looking at the big picture.
Yeah.
And those human stories are often the most revealing, providing insights into the motivations
Very.
and the consequences of historical actions.
Absolutely.
Speaking of consequences, let's shift gears a bit
Okay.
and talk about the aftermath of Richard's deposition.
Right.
What challenges did Henry V face after taking the throne?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Henry's claim to the throne was shaky at best.
Yeah.
He wasn't the direct heir according to the traditional rules of succession.
Right.
This meant that his rule was constantly challenged by those who believed Richard
Right.
or one of his supporters had a stronger claim to the crown.
So even though he had overthrown Richard, Henry wasn't exactly sitting comfortably on the throne.
Not at all. He faced rebellions, plots, and constant whispers of discontent.
Wow.
His reign was marked by instability
Okay.
and the ever-present threat of being deposed himself.
Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown.
Exactly. And Henry knew that he had to take decisive action
Right.
to consolidate his power
Okay.
and eliminate any potential threats.
And that brings us back to the mystery.
Yeah.
Surrounding Richard's death,
Right.
was Henry behind it?
That's a question that has haunted historians for centuries.
It has.
There's no concrete evidence to prove that Henry ordered Richard's murder, but the circumstances surrounding his death are certainly suspicious.
Right.
Yeah,
You mentioned earlier that Richard's body was put on public display.
I did.
Why would Henry do that if he had nothing to hide?
It was a brilliant, albeit ruthless political maneuver.
Okay.
By displaying the body, Henry could demonstrate to the public that Richard was truly dead. He could control the narrative and quell any rumors of Richard being alive and plotting a return.
So even in death, Richard was a powerful symbol.
Absolutely. His death, whether by natural causes or by foul play,
Right.
served to legitimize Henry's reign and solidify his grip on power.
It's a reminder that history is often written by the victors.
That's a valuable insight. We must always be critical of the sources we use to understand the past,
Right.
recognizing that they are often shaped by the biases and agendas of those who created them.
Well, I don't know about you, but this deep dive into Richard II's life has been both fascinating and thought-provoking.
I agree, he was a complex and controversial figure,
Yeah.
a king whose belief in his divine right to rule ultimately led to his downfall. But his story continues to intrigue us centuries later,
It does.
reminding us of the enduring power of ambition, betrayal, and the never-ending struggle for power.
This deep dive has really made me think about the nature of power and the dangers of unchecked authority. But before we get too philosophical, I think we need to wrap things up for today.
I believe we have covered quite a bit of ground.
We have joined us next time as we explore the final chapter of Richard II's story, examining the evidence surrounding his death and the legacy he left behind. So we've talked about Richard's rise to power,
Right.
his controversial reign, and his dramatic downfall.
Yeah, real roller coaster.
But the story doesn't just end there, right?
It doesn't.
His death.
Mm.
It's shrouded in mystery,
Absolutely.
and speculation
Yeah.
continues to fascinate historians.
For centuries.
So let's examine the evidence,
You okay?
or lack thereof.
Yeah.
What do we actually know about Richard's final days?
Well, we know that after his deposition, Richard was moved from castle to castle,
Okay.
ultimately ending up at Pontefract,
Pontefract.
a formidable fortress in Yorkshire.
Okay.
Accounts from the time suggest that, his confinement was harsh,
Right.
but the degree of his suffering is really uncertain.
It's hard to separate fact from fiction,
It is.
especially when so many of the accounts
Right.
were written by those who wanted to
Of course.
make Henry IV look good.
They had their own agendas,
Right.
those chroniclers.
So back to Pontefract.
Yeah. Okay.
We know Richard died there, but how?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
The official record states that he died of natural causes,
Okay.
but rumors of foul play,
Oh, yeah.
they
Yep.
circulated almost immediately.
Makes sense.
Some accounts suggest he was starved to death,
Wow.
while others claim he was murdered outright.
Possibly by assassins sent by Henry IV.
It sounds like something out of Shakespeare.
It does have all the elements of a great tragedy, doesn't it?
Yeah, a deposed king mysteriously dying in prison.
But regardless of the cause,
Yeah.
Richard's death had profound consequences
Right.
for England.
Okay.
It removed a figurehead for discontent, effectively ending any immediate threat
To Henry.
to Henry's reign.
And to further solidify his position,
Right.
Henry IV put Richard's body on public display.
He did.
It seems like a bold move.
It was a calculated act
Okay.
of political theater.
So by showing the body,
Exactly.
Henry could prove
He could quell any rumors
that Richard wasn't
about Richard still being alive
alive and coming
and
back.
plotting a comeback.
Right.
It was a way to demonstrate that the threat was truly over
Okay.
and a new era had begun.
But it also seems kind of disrespectful.
Well,
Don't you think?
customs were different back then.
Right.
You know, public displays of royal corpses.
While shocking to us,
Right.
were not uncommon in the 15th century.
Right. It's a reminder that history is full of things
It is
that we would think are strange today.
strange or even barbaric
Yeah.
by our standards.
So Richard's body is displayed.
Yes.
Henry IV's reign continues.
Mhm.
But what about Richard's legacy?
Well, Richard's reputation
Okay.
went through a series of transformations
Oh.
over the centuries.
Interesting.
In the immediate aftermath of his death, he was often portrayed as a weak and ineffective ruler,
Right.
a victim of his own miscalculations.
Makes sense.
But as time went on, a more nuanced picture emerged.
I can see how that would happen
Yeah.
with his story.
Yeah, some historians have argued that Richard was actually a visionary monarch,
Really?
ahead of his time.
Wow.
A king who sought to centralize power
Okay.
and modernize the monarchy,
Interesting.
but ultimately failed because he underestimated the forces arrayed against him.
So not just a tyrant, but a tragic figure, in a way?
A man who perhaps had good intentions,
Right.
but lacked the political skills
Hmm.
and the ruthlessness to survive in such a turbulent world.
And of course, we can't forget Shakespeare.
Of course, Shakespeare's influence on Richard's posthumous reputation?
Yeah, his play Richard II presented such a complex
It did.
and often sympathetic
Yeah.
portrait of the king.
And it really solidified
Look.
Richard's place in the popular imagination.
Shakespeare definitely had a way of turning history into drama.
He did, and in doing so, he helped to shape our understanding of the past,
Right.
often blurring the lines between fact and fiction.
I think we've covered a lot of ground today,
You have.
exploring the life, death,
Yeah,
and legacy of Richard II.
a fascinating figure.
What are your final thoughts on this enigmatic king?
I think Richard II serves as a cautionary tale
Okay.
about the dangers of unchecked power
Mm.
and the importance of understanding the limitations
Right.
of one's own authority.
Yep.
He was a king who truly believed in his divine right to rule,
Right.
but that belief ultimately blinded him
Yeah.
to the realities of power and led to his downfall.
Right.
His story reminds us that even the most powerful individuals are ultimately subject to the forces of history.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the complexities of Richard II and the enduring power of his story. Join us next time for another fascinating deep dive into history's hidden corners. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you won't miss a single episode. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those brain cells firing.